We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. The session is presented by the Embassy of Ireland. It is our pleasure to present today The Magician, Colm Tóibín in conversation with Sandip Roy. The Magician. Celebrated writer Colm Tóibín's latest novel, The Magician, is a complex yet empathetic tribute to the one of 20th century's most intriguing literary figures, Thomas Mann. Painting a remarkably intimate portrait of Mann's personal and creative life, Tóibín, in his trademark style, unravels the duality of the larger social, cultural, and political dynamics of pre and post-war Germany, along with the parallel narrative of a man burdened by his own repressed sexuality and rich inner life. In conversation with Sandip Roy, Tóibín pays homage to Mann and the wonders, tragedies, and sacrifices of his life. Colm Tóibín. Colm Tóibín is Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of Humanities at Columbia University and the author of 10 novels, including The Master in Brooklyn and 2 collections of stories. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages. In 2021, he was awarded the David Cohen Prize. Sandip Roy. Sandip Roy is a novelist and journalist whose first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title for the Asian Pacific American Literature Awards in the US, the Lico Award in India, and was listed for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and the Green Carnation Prize. He hosts the Sandip Roy Show for Audio Express, and his audio dispatches air weekly on public radio KALW-FM in San Francisco. A columnist for Mint Lounge, The Hindu, and The Times of India, Roy's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, First Post, and other outlets, most recently in the anthology Cat People. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to send in your questions or comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, The Magician, Colm Tóibín in conversation with Sandip Roy. Sandip, over to you.
Colm Tóibín, welcome virtually to Jaipur.
Thank you.
You know, when I read that The Magician was about Thomas Mann, I have to admit I was a little nervous because my sort of image of him was a bit ponderous and long sentences. But I have to say, this book was such a joy to read. I so enjoyed it.
No, thank you. Thank you.
My first exposure to Mann was actually a movie, because I remember as a teenager, at that time I was barely out to myself, and I had gone to London to visit my aunt, and Death in Venice was playing on television, and I wanted desperately to see it, but I didn't want, I was afraid if I expressed too much interest, I would be outed to the family. But luckily they were all very interested in classical music, so we watched it. But reading The Magician, I was fascinated that in your portrayal of him, he does not quite come across as the tragic, repressed homosexual figure I imagined him to be, sort of mapping him onto Death in Venice itself.
In her 90s, his widow, Katja Pringsheim, wrote her memoirs. She dictated them, in fact, a book called Unwritten Memories. And in that book, she describes the visit to Venice in 1911 with her husband, Thomas Mann, and with her brother-in-law, Heinrich Mann. And she says, yeah, that Tommy, she calls him Tommy, could not stop looking at this boy on the beach. She said he didn't follow him in the streets. I mean, that he didn't do. But she gives an account which really made me very interested, because she seems almost amused, certainly tolerant, not shocked in any way that her husband would have spent his time on a beach staring at this beautiful Polish boy, who biographers were later able to even identify and interview. And he did remember being in that hotel in Venice in that year. And it really brought me back to this family of hers, that she came from an assimilated a family of assimilated Jews, tremendously rich in Munich, very bohemian, cultured. Her brother was studying composing in Vienna with Mahler. Her father was a professor of mathematics. Her other brothers were doing, important things in culture. They gave marvelous parties. Her grandmother, Hedwig Dohm, was the most famous feminist in Germany and wrote, articles. And her grandmother, who was still alive in 1912 when Death in Venice came out, her grandmother loved Death in Venice, thought it was marvelous, and wrote an article in the Berlin newspaper praising the book. And her grandmother really didn't want Katia to marry. She was one of the first women to study science at a German university. And, but she decided in her early 20s to marry this man who was about 8 or 9 years older than she was. And she had 6 children with him. So the novel is partly a portrait of that marriage, as to, that all the things you expect to happen in the marriage don't happen. It's not an unhappy marriage. And it's not as though she has to repress enormous things in herself in order to survive in the marriage. It's not like that. And but he, of course, especially in the First World War, but also the rest of the time, he could be very silent domestically. He could be repressed. He could be a very solemn figure. So, he had his own demons, which includes, he lost Lübeck. In other words, his family were a famous family of traders, of commercial people in Lübeck. And when his father died, when Thomas Mann was in his early teens, his will said that the family business was to be wound up. And it had gone back generations. This meant that everything was dismantled. Their names were on everything, their beautiful house in the middle of Lübeck. All of that was to go. And the mother wanted to move to Munich, which in that year, I mean, we're talking about the 1890s, was a big move, or the late 1880s was a big move from Lübeck to Munich. In other words, from Protestant Hanseatic Germany down into Bavaria. And so everything was lost. And I think for a novelist, that's an enormous gift, because everything was lost. And what was lost was rich, because it was not just money. It was a sense in the streets of the small city of Lübeck that you were somebody, that your name meant something. Everybody would know who you were. And of course, in Munich, you were nobody. It was as though you walked in city streets thereafter, after Lübeck, as a sort of ghost. And your purpose as a novelist was to remake it, was to rebuild it. So Thomas Mann's first novel, published when he was 26, is Buddenbrooks, which goes back over 4 generations of the Buddenbrooks family, which are very closely based on the Mann family. And so he had that loss to work with in his first novel, as later on, when he would lose Germany, he would have that to work with in his novel, Dr. Faustus. So but he is a figure, I think, of great ambiguity. It's not a simple business of being a repressed homosexual. And it's not a simple business of being a sort of solemn German who made long speeches about Schiller and Goethe to, awed audiences. Often when he was making those speeches, he was really looking at a young man in the second or third row or the front row and noting him and gazing at him and noting in his diaries later on, young man in third row. And so he had a secret erotic life, which I think was very rich and fruitful in certain ways for his books. And in other ways, of course, he was indeed a repressed homosexual.
Talking about his erotic life, for somebody who was so aware of his public reputation, his wife, there's a line where his wife is saying in your book, "You are the most respectable man anyone has ever met." Why do you think he kept those diaries about his crushes on young men, terrified that it would fall into the wrong hands? Could you relate to that in him?
I think that the number of people who, I think that sexuality is such an important part of the self that it can never remain totally secret. That in other words, you often meet someone who's out to one person, but out to nobody else, out to some girl who's looking, who's very loyal, but no one else. But there's always a sense that one person needs to know, or one sign needs to be given. That it is very difficult to lead an erotic life entirely in private. I mean, it may be possible for some years, but it's for a whole lifetime. So the urge to keep a diary, and not only that, but in his will, he said the diary was to be published, and he wrote 35 years after his death, and then he crossed that out. It was 25 years after his death, that he wanted the diaries published. He wanted to be known. He wanted to be seen. But obviously he had problems in the meantime, which is that he was a very most respectable German alive. So this urge for secrecy and concealment on one side and revelation and being known on the other was part of the tensions within him, because I mean, he did publish Death in Venice. The problem he had when he published it was that no one really noticed. It wasn't as though he outed himself as a homosexual. People felt that the boy was a symbol of beauty and that the episodes in Venice were symbols of sort of decay in Europe. But nobody understood that the initial impulse for the story was entirely personal, was entirely autobiographical. And more than that, it was entirely a way of wanting to create images of the self that were clear.
And at the same time, what was amazing reading the book is his children led such open, almost brazen lives. 3 out of his 6 children were homosexual or bisexual in their relationships. They were happy to flaunt it and all of that. In his diaries, in his thoughts, or even as a novelist entering his head, do you think that must have seemed strange to him? Do you think he would have felt wistful about the openness with which they could conduct those lives?
I think wistful is a beautiful word here. And after the First World War, things changed in many countries. And people really did not want to be bossed around anymore. The idea of being sent into the trenches, was one thing, but the idea of having strict parents who told you what to do, that idea in many countries came to an end or just changed. So that in 1927, Thomas Mann meets a young man called Klaus Hauser, and Klaus Hauser says to him, "My parents have never, ever told me once what to do. My father was in the war, and once the war was over, no more of that." And so too with Thomas Mann's, especially with his 2 eldest children, Erika and Klaus. They became the sort of poster children in the Germany of the early 1920s. They were precocious, they were talented, and they were loud. And they did what they pleased. They slept with whomsoever they pleased. They said what they pleased, and they wrote what they pleased. And Klaus was a talented young writer, and Erika wanted to be an actress. And they went to Berlin. They went to America. They fell in love with, if they fell in love with 2 people, Klaus would write a play, and then the 4 of them would act in the play all over Germany, and they would be interviewed all the time. Then they would come home like drowned rats, wanting money, wanting to go back to their bedrooms. But of course, their homosexuality was just part of the deal. And who had girlfriends, who had boyfriends, who was bisexual, who wasn't bisexual. The 3rd child, Golo, who was also gay, was much more thoughtful and didn't have the same interest in glitter and sort of glory. But the first 2, certainly, their father watched them with amazement because, of course, he didn't have that sort of fun that they were having. So it was, what I was needed to do in this was, how do you do dialogue for another language for more than 100 years ago? Especially a language that's known for its, let's say, the length of its sentences and the sort of heaviness of its tone. And the only way I could do it was to do a 1920s Hemingway style of dialogue. Very short interruptions, people just saying something short, quick, down the page, rather than having long Germanic sentences that ended with a verb that I needed and to some extent, this is it was the only solution, because if you tried to do a sort of translatorese in dialogue, you lost the spark of the dialogue. And so the minute Klaus and Erika come into the picture, the dialogue becomes smarter and sharper in the book, because that was the only way I could manage that was to make them figures of the 20s. Thomas Mann himself, of course, he gave a great number of lectures. He was in the public eye, and a great change came in him. He was really a German patriot, and he hadn't put much thought into this. he was effectively apolitical in that sort of way people can be. But when the First World War broke out, he became militaristic, he became Prussian, he became fired up with a sort of reasons to win this war. Now, this is very peculiar because he seemed so cerebral, he seemed so calm before this. But this happened to great numbers of people. He wasn't alone in this. It was simply that his brother Heinrich took the opposite view. But many other writers in Germany, and indeed many intellectuals throughout Europe, had a sense that this catastrophe was needed in Europe, that something had to happen. This is very hard to understand because we look at it in retrospect. But at the time, this is what he felt. He was beginning to work on his novel, The Magic Mountain. He stopped working on that, and he spent really the 4 years wasting his time on an awful book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man. And he worked closely with a figure called Ernest Bertram, who would later become a sort of an important sort of Nazi intellectual. And Ernest Bertram knew much more than Thomas Mann did about, for example, Nietzsche. And he would come to the house every day. Katia, Thomas Mann's wife, didn't like him, just didn't like him. And but he was fired up too with sort of militaristic zeal. And so Thomas Mann worked on this book. And it's really about the role of the artist in society. It's all sorts of nonsense about Germany being a culture, and France being a civilization, whatever that distinction means. But he did mean that the roots of German, say, musical culture went very deep. And anyway, it was really, the book it's just been reissued, and it's really worth reading because it's really a sign. Novelists should not write philosophical treatises. They should not waste their time doing this. But when the war ended, of course, it ended in ignominious defeat. But not just that, it ended with people crippled and maimed, wandering the streets of Munich, looking for money and looking for shelter. So that, you know, his politics changed very quickly. There was a Soviet revolution in Munich, which lasted a short time. He was indeed seen as a great bourgeois figure at that time. And his politics changes very, very quickly. So that in the early 1920s, he moves from being a monarchist to being a Democrat. And of course, being a Democrat becomes a serious business in Germany as the 1920s go on. His loathing for his friends, Ernest Bertram, has no problem going on with the Hitler people. For Mann, there's something deeply distasteful about them to start with. They just, people on street corners, he has no time for them. It's almost a class thing. But then he realizes the dangers. Then he realizes what it is. What's that?
No, I was saying that's what struck me. Like his opposition to Hitler initially felt like, in reading the book, as these uncouth barbarians need to go away. They,
yes.
You know,
yes.
As opposed to an existential danger.
Yes.
It just went against his sensibilities
yes.
that these people were coming to power.
Yes, you're right, that nobody thought they were ever going to prevail. I mean, they looked like a group of malcontents, people on street corners, and you know, everything had been affected by inflation. And of course, there was great resentment about the treaties made at the end of the First World War. But this group didn't look like they would do anything other than just cause trouble at street corners. So his objection to them at the beginning was was about class. But of course, as they rose and rose, he became, I suppose, more and more firm in his own politics, and also more famous because The Magic Mountain appeared in 1925, and you know, it was such a substantial book, and it was set before the First World War, and it gave him a new sort of fame in Germany, and it gave him a sort of following in Germany. So he really did believe that he represented something in Germany, an old bourgeois idea of culture. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1929. And in winning the Nobel Prize, in representing bourgeois culture, in being a Democrat, he became a sort of target for the Nazis. He became an enemy of theirs. So there's a famous moment where he's giving this lecture and they begin to heckle him. And they're organized, they're all over the hall. And there's a sense of danger, a sense of physical danger. I mean, they had no problem beating people up. And so in 1933, when he was outside the country, when Hitler came to power, his family warned him not to come back in. And he never lived in Germany again. And so, you know, he became an implacable enemy This is strange because in 1914, this would have looked impossible. He became an implacable enemy of fascism and of anti-democratic movements.
You, as a novelist, did you relate to that uncertainty in him? Because I was actually surprised. I think of somebody like Mann as this very imposing figure, but he comes across as a man who is very uncertain, unstrongly to come out against the Nazis. His brother Heinrich is far more certain about what he believes in, as is his son. But as a novelist, did you relate to that uncertainty in Thomas Mann?
Yes, I did. That I would not have been interested in someone whose politics were stable and certain, whose erotic life was fully to be understood. It was the ambiguities in him, the mixtures, the instabilities that interested me. He's very hard to pin down. And even in 1933, when everyone was denouncing Hitler, he waited until 1936 to do this. And these 3 years, it mightn't look like long, but they were very long years to actually hedge your bets. His books were still on sale in Germany. He was treated differently to the other writers. His books were not burned in the big bonfire of 1933. Ernest Bertram, his friend, partly protected him, but he was seen as a more loftier figure. So he realized that once he openly attacked Hitler, his books would be taken off the shelves of bookshops in Germany. His daughter, his son, his brother, his wife all said, you have to, you cannot go on with this. And in 1936, he did. And in 1936, when he did it, the first time he did it, no one really paid that much attention. So he realized, he was, in a way, he was a master of sort of publicity. The second time, the open letter to the Chancellor of the University of Bonn was a major statement that went all over the world, and Thomas Mann became associated as one of the leaders of the anti-Hitler movement. So it's a very strange business, moving from hedging your bets, as you said, of being careful, and then becoming the sort of leader. And so, yeah, as a novelist, this idea of, I suppose, that he was never brave, and he was never fully brave. He was never fully one thing politically. And I could work with that.
Say from India are asked to write op-eds in, say, the New York Times or something on some political development in India. And I sometimes wonder, is that really the novelist's area of expertise?
Yeah, people have a view that novelists should really be able to think, since we can write and that we can create images, that really when you want to know what's going on somewhere, if you want to know about the Russian soul, ask a Russian novelist. And if you want to know about Modi or what's going on in India, get an Indian novelist. And therefore you'll get something, deep and rooted and very thoughtful. And what you get sometimes is a sort of foolishness, a sort of that a novelist can blow with the wind, can have an idea one day and can have another idea the next. Henry James is very good on this. He said, no word of man is ever the last word. And that really politicians have a way of forming policy. But yeah, novelists, it's not as though we're deep thinkers. If we were deep thinkers, we wouldn't be novelists. Often you have to have a sort of, not only a way of looking at surfaces, but a way of being able to see every point of view and being able to live in an ideology for a certain length. I don't mean a fascist ideology. I mean that a novelist could be a socialist, and a novelist then could be could be a liberal. And that could happen in the same day. You could be liberal in the morning, very liberal. And in the afternoon, no, we need to go further. We need to actually introduce serious policy for the distribution of wealth. Because I've just seen someone on the street and that person really was too poor and needed to have more money. And the only way, so you could go on all day being blown with the wind in various directions. And I suppose anyone who's been, say, Irish knows this, because we had to really rethink our entire relationship to nationalism when the IRA campaign began big time in the early 70s. Anyone of my age, had to start arguing and looking at not only about the cruelty of the bombing campaign, but the ideology behind it about Ireland as a nation, as a single entity, the 700 years of struggle against England, and we all had to say, like, this needs to be seriously reworked. And so that I certainly changed during that period. And so I was watching Thomas Mann in a way from that period of the First World War, where he's highly nationalistic. And later in the 20s, I was watching him from a perspective of someone who'd been in a country where people did go through those changes in my lifetime. But you're absolutely right that sometimes I read an op-ed by some novelists, I think novelists should really just tell us about the intricacies of the human heart. Did she fall in love that season? And why did the love not last? And that should be the op-ed piece.
I think, you've reviewed several biographies of Thomas Mann yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, I've written a good number of pieces about the family.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is interesting, that once the diaries appeared, he said 25 years after his death, so just in the late 70s, these diaries of Thomas Mann began to appear. Some of them had been burned, but enough of them were there to give us an idea of, in a way, how uneasy he was in the world. He takes a sleeping pill at night. He's worried about things. And also, as we spoke, his secret erotic life. You can imagine if you're a scholar and you're working on this idea of death in Venice as symbol or metaphor, and you realize from the diaries, this is personal. And so it was a big shock. It really was a big shock for everyone. Now, I have to say, I've been in Germany with this book, and Germany has not really recovered from that shock. That you see, Thomas Mann stands out because he was really behaved impeccably throughout the war. At the end of the war, his hands were fully clean. He had broadcast against Hitler. He had toured America against Hitler. So that the idea that in any way he had a dishonest personal life is very difficult for people to handle. And so I had a situation in Frankfurt Book Fair where a journalist from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a young fellow who was very intelligent in every other way, asked me how did I feel about queering Thomas Mann, as though I had somehow done this. And I said, well, hold on, I didn't write the diaries. I didn't write Death in Venice. I didn't write Dr. Faust. I didn't write, and but he looked at me as though I had somehow, done something to Thomas Mann. And so, for certain people, these I suppose these dramas within Mann are the people want him to be much more solid. So what happened then was that in 1995, in the same season, which often happens, 3 biographies of Thomas Mann came out in English, 3 big doorstopper books. And I'm a nerd, I'm just an old nerd. And the London Review books send me the 3 books, big door. And instead of just sending them back, saying, look, I'm busy, I'm going to go disco dancing, I've got a personal life, I need to go, I just said, oh, that sounds interesting. And I settled down with the 3 books. I'm talking about 800 pages each, And of course, they were intriguing because you could see the way the different biographers worked. Right. One of the biographers, Anthony Helbut, seemed to me to have a better handle on Mann's sexuality, on his, eros and thanatos in his work, Sex and Death, than the other 2. But the other 2 are sort of those plodding biographies that give you a lot of information nonetheless. And so I wrote a long piece about that. Then a book came out about the 2 children, Eric and Klaus. And again, I wrote about that. And then a very good book by an Australian woman called Evelyn Jures came out about Nellie Mann, who was Heinrich Thomas Mann's brother's second wife, who was really a barmaid. It was one of those micro-histories where she was finding the life of someone who wasn't important within this family and trying to bring them into the foreground, which I think is a very contemporary thing to do. But she did it ingeniously. And so I had all this information, plus I had the diaries. And I had also that sometime in the late 1970s, the view of Thomas Mann changed in the world because of the publication of the diaries. Had the diaries not been there, he would be still seen as this very repressed figure that, as you mentioned at the beginning, But the diaries did change that, and everyone responded to that. And he became much more interesting, of course. And that the books can be seen now in a different light.
But then when you started writing The Magician, as a novelist, what were you thinking were the gaps that you wanted to fill in?
Oh, you see, I think because we have now this strange conflict in an inner life. And one of the things that the novel can do that I don't think drama can do as well, or film, is tell you what someone is thinking, and then watch their silences, and then watch what they're saying, and watch the distance between what they're thinking and what they're saying. Now, Thomas Mann, more than anybody else, really, that idea of him as this stiff, formal figure, but the thoughts being different to that, obviously his closeted homosexuality versus the way he wanted his erotic life to appear in something like Death in Venice or in his diaries, and also the strangeness of his marriage. The idea is, you see, we have a cliche that a homosexual man marries, he's in the closet, his wife suffers, the marriage is awful, they're really unhappy, someone starts drinking, it's miserable. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that, because we have to think historically that Katia Mann in the early 20th century in Munich came from a great bohemian family. And sexual things did not shock her. The fact that someone was gay would not have surprised her. And we have to remember that, this idea...
She was actually happy that, I was going to say, she was actually happy that he was not going to be a philanderer like her own father was.
Yes, her own father was a tremendous philanderer, was always having actresses around. And she realized this when she was married, this fellow, that there wouldn't be any trouble with women. And also, part of the bargain was that he would not put their domestic life in jeopardy. In other words, that he doesn't seem to have, gone out at night cruising in parks, or he was very conservative and very domestic. He loved his domestic routine. So that you can really start working with that idea of someone loving their domestic routine. But what interested me more than anything was how strange the marriage was, and what a glittering figure Katia Mann was, how sharp and intelligent she was. As her policy that if she ever comes into the room in a book, she says something interesting, not necessarily funny, but somewhere or other, her intelligence shows each time she appears in the book. And that, working against the cliche of the unhappy marriage of the homosexual man, that actually the marriage was very fulfilling, oddly enough. And but also the strangest risks were taken. That this event, that on the Isle of Sylt, which is off the north of Germany, he did in 1927 meet this boy called Klaus Hauser, who was about 17. And he did really like him. And it did result in Klaus Hauser being taken home by the Mann family to Munich and staying in their house. And Thomas Mann in later diaries talks about kissing him. Now, I'm interested in this kiss. Again, I didn't make up this kiss. I didn't make it up. It's in the diaries. There it is. Klaus Hauser did live in this house. He did exist. So, but what's interesting is how much erotic charge you can give to a kiss. In other words, in a time when we can write about sex in any way we want, we won all those battles so long ago now, not to do anything more than a kiss, but to make that kiss something that really matters to him. And also to give Klaus Hauser, rather than being this sort of kid who's being sort of preyed upon by this older man, to make him into a figure who is, he was, tremendously intelligent, and he sort of knew what he was doing, knew where he was, because to be 17 in 1927 in Germany was to be precociously sexual. That's just the way things were then. It wasn't like that a decade earlier, and it may not have been like that a decade later. But these years in Germany, people were sexualized very young. And so I had to sort of work with all of that in a way to make it dramatic and credible, but also to make it interesting. Because whatever this story is, it's more than anything, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And when you talk about Katia Mann, I don't want to give stuff away for the readers, but there is not only does she tolerate it, at some level, she even stage manages little encounters for him with the young, handsome waiter. She's seen him that he's been staring at. And this is a much older man. Nothing is going to happen again. There is an enormous erotic charge in a scene where nothing is really sexual is happening, just this encounter. But it made me think, as gay men dealing with aging, there's also something strong where he realized, at some point, sometimes we think that, all the respectability and all the awards and all the autographs that we've won, sometimes we would trade that in to be just looked at with naked desire.
Thomas Mann, he's 75. So it's 1950, and he's in Switzerland, and he sees this sort of fleshy Bavarian waiter, and he really likes him. And he writes in his diaries that he would exchange world fame for being with this fleshy Bavarian waiter. And Katja and his wife, Katja, and his daughter, Erica, are worried about him because he's slightly depressed. And they think that it seems to be cheered up by the thought of this waiter. And so he would, they organized meetings between him and the waiter to cheer the old magician up. And this was the way things were. I mean that his sexuality was not a secret to them. It was also not a shameful matter to them, but it was something that they would do this for. And I mean, we have all this information from the diaries and from other sources, but he does say in the diaries, and it is sad what he says, I will exchange world fame, which he did have, for the time with this waiter.
Well, and we're almost out of time, but I should also mention that it's not just Thomas Mann. His daughter gets into a marriage with the very openly homosexual W.H. Auden for visa purposes. And right now, Colm, in Indian theaters, there's a Bollywood film playing called Badhai Do, which is about what is being called a lavender marriage, where a gay cop is marrying this lesbian to, get the parents off the back. And I'm like, wow, this is all feeling very contemporary.
Yes, she asked Christopher Isherwood first, but he didn't want it because his mother would be upset or something. But they sent a telegram to Auden. I mean, this was serious because she was losing her German passport, and she was going to become stateless. And the Nazis really had it in for her, and because she put on this cabaret against them, and she was outspoken, and she was a lesbian and all this. And so Auden sent back a telegram saying delighted. So she put on a suit and tie, and she went to England, and she married him. And this made a huge difference to her because it meant she could work for the BBC during the war. She was a British citizen. And good old Auden, he was helpful when he needed to be. He was asked who was the most boring writer in the world, and he said, "Oh, my father-in-law." This man never saw the point of his work, and just couldn't understand him when he spoke. And he sort of mumbled, Auden. And of course, Auden didn't see the Magic Mountain as being very much to his taste either. So no love lost.
A wise friend once told me she was always afraid of meeting a writer she adored because she said they rarely live up to their books. Does the same advice hold for trying to write a novel about the life of a writer whose books you might have read and admired as a young person?
Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful moment where Susan Sontag, age 14, goes to Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles. She wants to meet Thomas Mann. And of course, he's not that sort of figure. He's not a meter and greeter. So she was very disappointed by how banal he was. But I think that was her problem much more than his. He does have an heroic period where in about from 42 to 44, he's very good friends with Roosevelt, and it's agreed that he can tour America. And he can talk about after the war. His speech is generally the same speech called The Coming Victory of Democracy. It's not about defeating the Nazis. It's not about bringing Germany down. It's about what comes after, what matters. Why is this war being fought? And he got big crowds. He would get as many as 5,000 people in places like Oklahoma, Ohio. And he would speak in his faltering German, and these crowds would come. And this was really, I suppose, heroic in that he had found a tone to use that rose above. I mean, it's one of those op-ed moments where it rose above the mere political moment of now into some general philosophical idea, what we share, what Germany, what the Germany of the future, Germany of the past shares with America, is some idea of liberty, some idea of democracy. And he spoke very beautifully, and it mattered. There was no Italian doing this. There was no Japanese person doing this. You know, he was almost alone in representing what Germany might mean in the future. And he was also, you know, when he went home, he was writing his novel Dr. Faustus in his beautiful house in Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles. But there was a sense for those three years that someone like him, who had been through the struggle himself against German nationalism, who embodied in a way the arguments he was making, that he could emerge as a figure, I suppose, that really represented light, democracy, and freedom in a very dark time. And when you look back at those speeches in that period, he really does become, I think, politically important. For once, we have an artist, a novelist, who's actually making sense politically. I think because he's rising above the particular moment to set certain principles in stone, principles that he believes the Germany of the future will share with America, as indeed we can see at the moment it does.
To end, Colm, if somebody were to one day write a novel about the life and times of Colm Tóibín, do you have a suggestion for the title?
I think it would be very dull. I think it would be called Dull, sheer tedium. Tedium and dullness would be a good title for the book.
Well, you never know. People might have thought the same of Thomas Mann one time, but there was so much to discover.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colm and Sandip, for a wonderful conversation. This session is presented by the Embassy of Ireland. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged in to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all three of our venues, Front Lawn, Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Stay tuned for the next session.